Good morning. My name is Michael Ignatieff. I'm the rector and president of Central European University, and it's a very special pleasure to welcome you to our beautiful new space. I hope you enjoy it as much as we do today. I strongly recommend the coffee shop at the back of the hall. Very good coffee. I want to thank Julius Rostash, my colleague and friend. I want to thank other organizers for the work that they've done putting this together. But most of all, I want to thank you for coming, and for coming now. As some of you know, we're in the middle of a little local difficulty, as the British would say. A battle of principle and a battle of politics to defend the right of this institution to be here as a free institution in Budapest, which is our home. Many of you have associations with the university, so I don't need to tell you about CEU, but we've been here for 25 years. We love it in Budapest. Budapest is our home. Our Hungarian identity is as important to us as our American identity, and we're holding on to both. And let me make it clear to you that life goes on. A lot of incoming fire, but we're a university, and so we do this kind of stuff every day. And your presence here is a sign of business as usual, as a continuity with our commitments. And our commitments on Roma education and Romani access are very long-standing. Some of you know that we've had Roma access programs since 2004. We have had access programs to graduate education for a long time. We've had partners with some of the great Romani funding groups and organizations across Europe for a long time. This is not, the point I would make about this is that our commitment to these programs is not something we do over there. It is definitional of what the university is. It's critical and central to the whole mission of this place. And as rector and president, I want to affirm that in front of you so that you know just how important this is to the future of our university. And we feel we've got a pretty good guy here to my right here who's going to be leading the Romani Studies program next year as the first chair. We hope to have consolidate, develop, grow, improve, take criticism from you about what we're doing and doing it better, and I hope the day will produce, it's a critical study, it's a critical day. I like the word critical, that's what universities do. I hope you will be critical of yourselves. I hope you will be critical of, if necessary, to the degree that you know things about it, about our programs, and suggest to Julius ways in which we can do a better job. But I do want to say to you how essential this work is to us, and assure you another thing is we're not going anywhere. Is that perfectly clear? There we go. So my point is I hope we'll be able to host conferences and gatherings like this for many years to come and build our engagement with a wonderful European and global community over the years ahead. I have to run off because I've got a day job, but I do want to say you're all welcome. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you again for being here. Your very presence indicates a commitment to an institution I think we all have come to care about deeply. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julius Rostas. I am the chair of Romani Studies here at CEU, and I'd like to welcome you in this wonderful place. I would like to start thanking our leadership, the rector and the rector Ignatiev and the provost Liviu Matei for their continuous support in developing Romani studies here at CEU. I'd like to thank our generous donors for their support. Otherwise, it would be quite difficult to have these events. I'd like to thank you all for making possible this event, because without you, it will be just a few of us having a coffee here. And of course, I would like to thank Marton and my whole team at the Roma Access programs for putting together this event. As you might know, this event is part of the Roma in European Societies initiative, which is a multi-donor initiative funded by the Velux Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, Roma Initiatives Office, and the Roma Education Fund. It builds on the experience of CEU of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program and aims to improve the situation of Roma at different levels by contributing to the knowledge production. So in this way, in this sense, we are offering fellowships, we'll conduct advanced research, and will contribute to the course development at other universities in the world as well. The second way to contribute to the improvement of the situation of Roma is by developing qualified cadre to lead institutions and ideas for social change. And in this sense, we will award 10 scholarships, at least 10 scholarships every year here for Roma students in MA programs. We'll offer internships and placements support for our alumni, and will engage with business community. And the third point where we would like to bring our contribution to improving situation of Roma is by offering the opportunities and platforms to exchange ideas. So in this sense, we'll organize around 2 or 3 conferences per year on Romani studies here at CEU, and we'll have also different workshops. We will continue organizing the summer school on Romani studies, and we intend to soon launch a journal on Romani studies, so much needed journal on Romani studies. I'd like to use this opportunity to share my thoughts on Romani studies. To me, the use of critical social theories in Romani studies is a priority. And to me, it's key that we engage with other scholars from other fields of studies and will not remain isolated. Many problems faced by Roma originate in the misunderstandings of who is Roma and what the meaning of that is. Yes, we are diverse, and our internal stratification works differently from that of other groups. By inquiring Romani identity, we'll contribute to a better understanding of the problems faced by Roma nowadays. On the other hand, any exploration of Romani identity is incomplete without analyzing the relations of Roma with non-Roma since their arrival into Europe. Hence, the importance of anti-Gypsyism for Romani studies. If anyone wants to understand the current situation of Roma, they must look at the forms of cooperation and oppressions suffered by Roma. I also would like to see Roma as a political subject. Too often, Roma are exoticized, are framed as an issue of poverty and social inclusion. I recognize that I'd like to see a more balanced discourse on Roma, where we also focus on Roma as a subject of political games in the larger context of political systems and in the context of the fights, of the fight for social justice. Gender politics and the role of Romani women is an important topic for me. We have to recognize, but also respect and celebrate our diversity. By that, we have to recognize that inside Roma, there are other minorities that we do have to respect and celebrate that. We cannot claim equality just for some. Equality should be for all. So I believe that Romani feminism has a significant potential to bring change in Romani communities and in our societies. I do not want to elaborate a comprehensive agenda for the future of Romani studies, but I wanted just to share with you my thoughts. And over the next day, we'll continue to share our ideas and thoughts on these matters and others. Well, I would like to welcome you once again, and let's enjoy the 2 days we spent together here. I'd like now to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Professor Ethel Brooks, and my dear friend, Ethel. Ethel is an associate professor at the Rutgers University. Is a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Is the chair of the European Roma Rights Center, of the board of the European Roma Rights Center, and the co-director of Romani Studies summer school here at CU that we are doing it together for 3 years or 4? 3 years. So please welcome Ethel.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Julius Rostas for his kind invitation to deliver the keynote for what promises to be not only an exciting conference, but a groundbreaking one. This conference marks a milestone in our collective venture into critical Romani studies, and also a moment of celebration of Julius's position as the CEU chair for Roma in Europe, and of CEU OSF and Velux Foundation's commitment to this crucial work in supporting knowledge production, not only about, but also by Roma and non-Roma together. Thanks also to Martin Rovid for his brilliant organization and the whole team that has really supported this conference and the success that will, well, we can see by the very presence of all of you that we'll be able to celebrate over the next 2 days. I want to also extend my deepest thanks to CEU President and Rector Michael Ignatiev and CEU Provost and Pro-Rector Liviu Mate, and to the entire CEU community for their unwavering and deep commitment to maintaining the scholarly integrity, freedom of thought, and transformative work that this institution has undertaken. At a time when CEU is under siege and threat, the threat of Lex CEU hangs over the work all of us are doing across the world. The knowledge and dedication and the vow to continue this crucial work serves as an inspiration and a beacon for knowledge producers everywhere, in every field and in every site. This is really the site of the front lines of academic freedom at this moment. And so it's really just an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. And Romani Studies is central to that commitment and to that knowledge production. Roma have been the proverbial canaries in coal mines as nationalism has pushed its way back into Europe, the US, and across the world. And it's only fitting that in this moment, CEU has established the Roma in European Societies Initiative and the chair in Romani Studies. So before I begin, I want to have a New York moment where I'm going to stand up and say, and ask a question, and I need a response. Roma in the house. look at that. Come on, up and loud. All right, see, this is my New York moment. Thank you, thank you. See, now, this is the only place in the world that we could be in a site, an institution of higher learning in this way, and actually get a response. And I do this, whenever when I teach my classes, when I give lectures, it's one of the things that I tend to do. And it really, the one thing that I love when I come to CEU is that I get a response. Although no one did a woo-woo in response, but it's okay. Next time. We can keep doing it across the day. But I want to say that thank you. It's really good to see all of you. So I want to begin and have you have a look at the image that's above me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. My title in the paper is a general one about Romani Studies, but in particular, I guess, if I were to think about an alternate title, it would be The Archive and the Colony, Critical Romani Studies as decolonial practice. And to think particularly about the role of being out of place and what it means to think about evidence, practices, identity formations as perhaps out of place. On a research visit to London, I was working in the Prints, Drawings, and Paintings Archive at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I had seen in one of the catalogs a reference to an 1861 photograph that was called Granny Buckland Gypsy Queen. And I was sort of thinking, what would the actual image look like? Because it was only the title, and you really don't know. So I spent a few weeks searching the photo and print archives for the image with no luck. Finally, after ordering boxes upon boxes of photographs to be brought up to the Prints and Drawings study room, a very helpful archivist suggested that I begin looking through the boxes of state photos of 19th century queens, telling me that since I hadn't found it anywhere else, and she was sure it had to be somewhere in the archives, that looking under the sort of category of queen would prove helpful. So, that day in one box, among European queens, empresses, and grand duchesses of the 19th century, this image showed up. And this was the image. And I've pondered the irony of the photo being lost in the archive. The title, the subtitle, and what's written on the back is Queen of the Berkshire Gypsies, 1861, as I say, sitting alongside the queens of England, Austro-Hungarian empresses, the queens of Portugal and Spain. What does this mean? And I was thinking, my mother, if she had been alive, would probably argue that it was only fitting, but I'll talk about that at another time. Happy to talk about that over coffee. In the sepia image, Granny Buckland is sitting akimbo with her elbow propped on her knee and her face resting on her hand, her diclo on her head, and a look of, I can't figure out, is it indifference, is it annoyance, is it resignation? I want to think maybe it's refusal on her face. The photograph, which was finally found in the box of 18th and 19th century queens, and the image itself, to me, seems out of place. And how do we understand that place, right, among Queen Victoria, Queen Louisa of Portugal, Maria Theresa of Austria, and others? What's her place in the archive? How do we understand the fact that I spent weeks looking for it, looking under, categories such as ethnographic photographs, right, gypsies, Roma, right, all sorts of things, and couldn't find it? And how do we understand that in relationship to the history of colonialism among these 19th century symbols of Europe's imperial project? A critical Romani studies would open up these questions, and I'm particularly interested in forging a connection between our project and a larger decolonial turn in knowledge production that's taken place, much of it based on the work of Frantz Fanon, of Gloria Ansel-Dua, Walter Mignolo, Edouard Glissant, and Angela Davis. And I'm committing to building these connections through a post-colonial feminism that I learned from my teachers, Laila Abulukhod and Gayatri Spivak. And I ask these questions because I believe that a move toward a critical Romani studies is at the same time a reckoning of the past, but certainly about claiming the future. It's also a way of thinking about Romani studies as a disciplinary project, as an historical project, and of the construction of the Romani archive in relation to wider colonial projects. So academic and non-academic specialists spread across Europe and into the US built the archive of Romani studies, arguably captured in the first issues of the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society. These first issues printed current and past studies by non-Roma about Romani subjects, documenting the Romani language and its dialects, folklore, ethnographic practices, family structures, and histories. These sort of self-proclaimed non-Roma Romani rise, gypsy kings, were mostly men, although there were some women, including the prominent Dora Yates of Liverpool, and these became central and sort of the core of the Romani studies canon. While they did crucial work in documenting Romani language and history, with also including sometimes making up stories, making up words, making up language, and making up folklore, they were, in the fashion of parallel imperial and colonial projects, actively constructing the Romani subject over which to rule. And that's really central to then how we understand the space of Romani studies, even to this day. You know, in this way, the epicenters of Romani studies were the very same as the imperial epicenters: London, Paris, Budapest, and Vienna, as well as Madrid, Bucharest, and Edinburgh. And this particular combination of scientism and fantasy came to mark the imperial project just as much as it marked Romani studies as a project. Edward Said describes this project, which is centrally about knowledge production and domination, with regard to European colonial projects about the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And he calls this Orientalism. So Said argues, quote, taking the 19th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, and ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, end quote. And so now thinking about this, what Said said and how he described this, I want to turn to some of the very first issues of the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, and how they point to what I would argue is a parallel corporate institution for dealing with the Romani subject, its archive, its journal, and its defining logic. All of the elements that are laid out by Said are part of this project, right? This, what we could call a Gypsy Lorist project, bounded by the scientism of formulating results and finding true answers. So the very first paragraph of the first issue of the journal in 1888 says, quote, good wine needs no bush, said our journal, and our journal, we trust, will thrive without self-commendation. Still, a word may be said as to its aims. They are to gather new materials, rearrange the old, and to formulate results, so that little by little to approach the goal, the final solution to the gypsy problem. And I just want to pause there for a second, just let that sink in. It's already been solved, but in so many and in such diverse ways that the true answer still remains a matter of doubt, if indeed any true answer has ever yet been given. So is everyone familiar with that? Have you all seen that? Right, so so just thinking about that first kind of framing of what the journal's purpose is. So in the 1888 formation, the final solution to the gypsy problem is an academic one, to be solved by knowledge production and careful scholarly debate. And I think it's no coincidence that the same language is deployed 40 years later. And to make this connection, or 50 years later, but to make this connection, we have to understand the larger context, even down to the formation of a scientific question as a solution to a problem. Right? The fact that it's framed as a gypsy problem that can be solved through science. In Along the Archival Grain, Anne Stoller searches for the contours of the archive, its production, and sees the watermarks of the relation of the archive to the unwritten. the contours of the archival grain, Stoller argues, that, quote, yet in attending that which is not written, there is something of Levi-Strauss's vision of anthropology in what follows. By this I do not mean that it plumbs for the hidden message, or those subliminal texts that couch the real below the surface and between written lines. Rather, it seeks to identify the pliable coordinates of what is constituted as colonial common sense in a changing imperial order in which social reform, questions of rights and representation, and liberal impulses and more explicit racism played an increasing role. As imperial orders changed, so did common sense. So what is the common sense that ends up framing the archive? And the issues of the journal that I've seen and that I've looked through, right, it doesn't have the same kind of texture, because what Stoller does when she's looking in the archive is look for these handwritten notes, these contingent moments where you can sort of see colonial common sense trying to solve a puzzle that it's faced with, but not really wanting to put them into the main body of the archive. And so what I was trying to think about is what would be the equivalent in a journal, which seems like, you know, you have a sort of very clean version. I don't have those notes. I need to sort of figure out if there's a place where you have the marginal notes, perhaps in Liverpool, of producing the journal. So where is that the constitutive outside, right? And thinking about how I maybe want to briefly turn to the sections of the journal that frame the articles. Because these sections of the journal aren't its scientific body, but they're in the journal, even as they're outside of it. And here in particular, I want to draw your attention to the epigraph and the notes section, the notes and queries section of the first issue, say the first 5 issues. But the epigraph that comes actually before the quote that I read above it's taken from a poem by Pierre-Jean de Béranger called Les Bohémiennes. And it says, sorcier, bateleur, au filou, reste immonde. D'un ancien monde, sorcier, bateleur, au filou, gay bohémienne, d'où venez-vous? So wizards, clowns, or tricksters, foul remains of an ancient world. Wizards, clowns, or tricksters, gay bohemians, where do you come from? And that beginning frame, right, before we're introduced to the scientific work of the journal, right, to this kind of purporting of a framing of all the work that's been done in Romani Studies, you know, before 1888, which is sort of how it's then posited, we read, or we skim over quickly, in what I would argue would be perhaps an unthinking way, right, this little poem. It's just it's a throwaway in some ways. But a poem that poses Roma as foul or dirty, ancient leftovers, right, that whole reste immonde. Gay and carefree, but also carrying out trickery. This becomes the colonial common sense frame for the truth and seriousness that then are to follow this and lie in the pages of the journal. This unwritten frame is, in this case, written into the pages in a way that doesn't allow us to think it through, that doesn't allow us to keep it within the scientific pursuit, right? It becomes something that we're not going to question. It's common sense. How's my time? Okay. The other half of the frame is actually at the end of the journal, which is in the notes and queries section. This section contains letters to the editor, scholarly debates, and solicitations. Some of the letters are sent in by Romani writers, and I find it interesting because in the body itself you don't really have Romani scholars producing knowledge, but you do have in the letters section clearly delineated, like, you know, you don't have it delineated like these are non-Roma writing, but you do have, when a Romani writer writes into the letters section, there's a little note ahead that says, you know, this person is a Romani person from blah, 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 and is writing in, you know, this way, and sort of, so it's very framed. So they contain corrections on the Romani language, requests for work, and in issue number 5 of the first volume, the claiming of ownership over a family heirloom that had been discussed in the journal's pages. These interventions show a Romani production of knowledge, right, a call for ownership and heritage, and an understanding of economic relations. And in this way, you know, they're posited at the end notes, and yet they become actually central. They are central to the very production of the Gypsy Lore Society. and the maintenance of a kind of its non-Romani monopoly on knowledge as lore, just as they contain clues about the erasure of that production within the pages that have preceded. They're deliberately separated from the scholarly articles kept in the notes and queries section as the outside of knowledge produced about and the discursive construction of Romani subjects in relation to the Romani rise. They are at once outside the journal in its informal section, marked as a democratic note or query, right, where anyone can write in. And they're also framed as particularly Romani when they come from a Romani writer. At the same time, these notes and queries actually, I would argue, undo the archive, right? They serve to question colonial common sense. They become the response to the poem that begins at the beginning as a frame. Romani queries and letters to the editor open up the possibility of what Maria Lugones calls a fractured locus in resistance. Toward a decolonial feminism, Maria Lugones outlines the work of the decolonial feminist. Quote, that is, the decolonial feminist tasks begin by her seeing the colonial difference, emphatically resisting her epistemological habit of erasing it. Seeing it, she sees the world anew, and when she requires herself to drop her enchantment with woman as a category, the universal, and begins to learn about other resistors in colonial difference. The reading moves against social scientific objectifying reading, attempting rather to understand subjects, the active subjectivity emphasized as the reading looks for the fractured locus in resistance to the coloniality of gender as a coalitional starting point. So here I want to return, and I have a lot on the notes and queries section. I'm going to skip it, but I'm happy to talk about it again in questions and answers or at some other point. But I want to return to the image of Granny Buckland and ask whether it, in fact, could be read, and it may not be able to be, but could it be read as a fractured locus in resistance to the coloniality of gender? You could read her face, right, and as resignation, certainly, or perhaps as a refusal to please the camera, even as she's posed in front of its gaze. As we know, this moment captured in 1861 is part of a larger practice of photographing, capturing, and documenting colonial subjects across the world. From the photographs of Beirut-based Bonfi and Company, which specialized in Orientalist archetypes ranging from Bedouin chiefs to pyramids, sphinx and temples, to veiled women carrying water, or in the colonial postcards documented by Malik Alula, Granny Buckland's image indeed serves as a type, not a Romani type, but a Gaje type. The image of the colonial subject framed as the constitutive outside of the modern free subject, the rights-bearing human, the citizen, the Romani Rai. But if we read it along the grain of its production, through the lens of colonial difference, we can also see the image as its undoing, and perhaps think about how it works in relation to, and perhaps in resistance to, the coloniality of gender. And this effect, I would argue, is actually multiplied at the moment that the image is found, right, out of place in a box of colonial queens. It has the possibility of decolonizing, precisely because it lays bare the colonial production of the image and its connection to other colonial formations, practices, and productions. And in this way, I guess a central task of our work is to open up these connective moments, these institutions and historical formations that can help us understand the place of Roma within larger institutions of empire, capital, and dehumanization, all of which make up the colonial project. And this work would help us, I think, better understand the relationship of Roma, refugees, and Muslims within the European imaginary, or the continued marginalization, violence, and impoverishment to which Romani communities are subjected on a daily basis. Violence that ranges from harassment and beatings by the police, as was the case earlier this month of a Romani boy in Serbia waiting in the schoolyard to walk his younger brother home, who was then beaten by police after being harassed by local authorities. Or 2 weeks ago, the 3 Romani girls in Rome, sisters aged 4, 8, and 20, who were burned to death in an arson attack on their caravan. Granny Buckland produced as the abject subject of the photographer's gaze, opens up the possibility of the fractured locus in resistance. And again, I'm taking seriously the point that Laila Abu Lughod makes about, we can't really romanticize resistance because when we end up criticizing one structure of power, we back up into another. However, I want to read her as a queen, a Romani Rani, this figure placed in a box of European queens, and possibly a counter to the rule of the Romani rise of Gypsy Laurism. She's out of place, and as such, her image and its production open up, at least for me, a space for decolonial critique, in the same way as do the letters written by Romani subjects, the interventions into the discourse of Gypsy Laurism or Romani Studies by Romani people, community members, activists, academics. We're the inheritors of that critique as well, across a century of disciplining. And even the presence, as I said, of Romani scholars in this room today. We're still out of place in the position of the constitutive outsider. And we must make a reckoning of these practices and open up space for decolonization of the past and the present, but certainly of the future. Through a deeper engagement with the out of place, to have us think through what that means and what that could possibly mean. Through what Spivak has called a deconstructive embrace, drawing from Derrida, through an epistemology marked by love, we can come to a critical Romani studies that reclaims the future, which, in my vision, is a decolonized feminist future, one that takes seriously the enormity of the colonial project and its dehumanizing processes, as well as the possibilities of resistance and the fractured claims of the colonized, gendered Romani subjects. This collective future can only be forged through a particular attention to Romani feminist subjectivity and a dedication to a critical, decolonized Romani practice. Through this decolonized practice, we construct critical Romani studies, and we can begin to reclaim our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ethel, for this excellent speech. What we thought is that we move on to the first panel and then we open up the discussion with Ethel and Julius. I would like to invite you also to come to the left side of the auditorium. You don't have to stand there. And I would also like to invite the three distinguished speakers to come to the panel. Yeah, you have space for everybody? Yeah. Yeah, so here it is, yeah. So, welcome everybody again. And we move on immediately to related reflections from three distinguished speakers that I am going to introduce you now. The first speaker is going to be Andrei Mirga, on my left, who really needs no introduction, but he has been involved in Romani studies for several decades. Currently, he is the chair of the Roma Education Fund. He holds many positions, one of them that he was head of the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues at OSCE between 2006 and 2013. And I think what for many of us is very important are his articles co-authored by Nikolai Georgiev, which I think are really foundational in the discipline of what we can call critical Romani studies. So let me give the floor first to Andrei Mirga, and then we go one by one.
Thank you. I would like to welcome all. What I intend to present is more some reflection or review of Surdu's book. I think you know this publication. I have to stress here, it is hard to review a book written by someone who used to advocate for Roma cause and who benefited from being in the movement. His writing was supported by OSF, among others, and who concludes that there is nothing such as a Roma in reality. We are, in fact, a construct of classifiers, scholars, and policymakers constituted in the process of categorization and classifications. Who am I, therefore? What I should think about myself, my siblings, my parents, all of us born in small community, different and separated from the surrounding majority, speaking our mother tongue Romanes, the same way parents and my parents and parents of my parents did in the past. Are we non-existent, or we are just as a social construct of those who classified us or researched us as such? I'm not certain to what extent reflections that the lecture of this book gave reason for, though would fit in well into the topics of discussion of this conference. For sure, I am not advanced in critical theory studies or critical race stories or intersectionality, so I hope to learn more about what is in the program named as a critical approach to Roma studies. Why I choose to discuss Surdu's book? First, because he makes knowledge production topic central to his book. With the rising number of Roma with higher education, we aspire more and more to enter the field of scholarship and expertise and define our place and space among knowledge producers about Roma. Second, because the way he approaches ethnicity and Roma identity in particular, he advocates and argues for nominalist or constructivist approach, which, if to be followed, it would mean that we are reduced to meaningless subject of ethnicity that is constructed by those in power or and imposed on us for whatever reasons, power, interest, prestige, etc. And eventually, we as ethnic entrepreneurs, we Roma activists here and scholars, we are self-interested in perpetuating this ethnicity that, by the way, is stigmatizing and separate Roma from the society. Surdu publication, therefore, requires review, as he pretends to come up with a new paradigm in studying Roma, turning into the light on those who constructed Roma through their scholarship or expert-type analysis and policy research that aimed at finding a solution to identified and reified Roma problems. No doubt, Surdu book is challenging and in some parts even convincing when he presents case studies, for example. Those who read the book know which are these chapters. It raises, however, many questions, both regarding the way he presents the arguments. He quotes and refers to series of authors and publications that support his perspective and proposes alternatives. Here he provides very few ideas that are not new or convincing at the end of the book. For example, he's talking about the need to depoliticize, de-ethnicize, de-racialize Roma discourse, and instead to be focused on citizenship rights. We heard this many times in many places as well. Anyway, Surdu book poses some questions in publication of the CEU, and that may have its significance for various circles of scholars and policy makers, and that's why I think we should respond to Surdu's assertions and arguments. This is not a thorough review of the book. I may come up with it in later stage. These are some thoughts prompted by Surdu books and stance he is taking on some of the topics. I am also leaving out of the discussion here the issue of terminology he is using, because he is using, for example, Roma or Gypsies / Roma, Gypsies, Roma, whatever. It's many ways how he's addressing, and he's explaining why he's doing so. Who are Gypsies, Roma / Roma in ontological sense, and how they are constituted as an object of science and policy research in epistemic sense seems to be a crucial question for this book. His assumption is that there is an epistemic community, and within it a specific type of policy community, and expertise of both is used in knowledge productions about Roma. He adds, however, that it is the political field or type of regime that prevails here. It constitutes Gypsies, Roma as a political entity, and creates a Roma issue which afterwards is objectified by various academic disciplines. In other words, academic construction of Roma as an object of study is highly dependent on political context. Here, knowledge production about Roma is byproduct of political willpower, and what is being said about Roma is authoritative, because it is associated with those who are holding the power, and they also hold the authority of the truth. For him, categorization of Gypsies later of Roma should be seen in its historic context in order to understand the epistemic claims made by authorities that led to the social formation of the group. He claims that authorities' categorization lead to social formation of the group. However, a few pages after, Surdu maintains just something opposite, to quote, "Under the influence of epistemic communities, together with pressure from the Romani movement, the policymakers' bodies, such as the governments, international organizations, and the bodies of European Union, adopted essentialist classification of Gypsies, Roma, consequently developed inappropriate essentialist list of policy answers." End of the quote. Analyzing literature on general classificatory practices regarding ethnicity or minority, and those specifically tied to Roma, leads him to conclusion that, to quote, "Those labels as Roma in the process of standardization of Roma identity internalize the scientifically constructed stereotypes, which are mostly negative, though," he adds, "of course there are also some positive stereotypes in the expert and scientific production of knowledge on Roma, such as those related to artistic abilities and especially music." He asserts that the negative image of Roma needs to be analyzed, challenged, dismantled, and deconstructed, and that is his main motivation in writing this book. The question, however, is where he ends with this noble motivation, at the level of stereotypes, even if scientifically produced. Key to understanding his position and the way he is approaching the Roma is to follow on his assumptions and choices he makes in defining his approach. He is skeptical and disbelieves that ethnicity is indicating a distinct social reality. He chooses nominalist or constructivist approach against realist essentialist, and makes clear that Roma in fact are fiction, brought into existence by those who researched or counted them, and thanks to that, their concepts, classification, and categories, something that is in practice of scholars and policymakers. Roma are constituted as an ethnic group, having an ethnic standardized identity, something he sees as an essentialist approach to Roma, and he is countering it or rejecting it. As a result, all of his analysis leads him to a denial of existence of genuine Roma minority of people. Okay. So, in fact, current Roma ethnicity is the product of classification and categorization, or simply construction by those who have had interest in doing so, both scholars and experts and some entrepreneurs, means among them also obviously us, Roma. He adds that in the case of Roma, this process is not primarily driven by Roma political community, but by external or academic experts and political community. Two case studies devoted to the reports of the World Bank and UNDP, respectively, aim to illustrate this. Both institutions fall fall subject to heavy criticism of Surdu regarding methodologies of gathering data and for carrying stigmatizing messages regarding Roma ethnicity associated with poverty, first one, or World Bank, or welfare dependency in the case of UNDP production. He is, of course, against realist and essentialist approach to Roma. In his view, it dominates the Romani studies and in applied sociology, in which Roma ethnicity became unquestionable and unquestioned orthodoxy, to use his words. Of course, something he wants to challenge in his book. He asserts his positions clearly. I quote from page 33. I do not affirm that Roma people do not exist, but I assert that Roma population exists as a negative and oppositional construction made by dominant group and self-internalized by many of those labeled as Roma. So we self-internalize what has been said about us. Surdu also accepts, I believe uncritically, that in social theory, I quote, mainstream sociological perspective regard ethnicity as a social construct. For some of us who are interested in this topic of ethnicity, especially in globalized world, there are many other stories of ethnicity that may be better prepared or worded to describe the situation of Roma. Surdu is not reflecting on this. To quote Aronov and Kubik, scholars from Rutgers University, by the way, although some scholars consider ethnicity to be primordial or at least perennial, it is neither wholly chosen or assigned. They record here anthropologist Thomas Eriksson, who stressed that they are both, and that identity is elastic and negotiable, but not infinitely flexible. Aronov and Kubik point out that, to quote, the acquisition of ethnic identity is generally associated with the growing sense of self-consciousness, linking with so-called modernity. And in this process, identity is deliberately politicized, especially when it is threatened by forces of domination and or assimilation, like colonialism or globalization. Therefore, there is nothing threatening in politicizing ethnicity. In the case of Roma ethnicity, something that is Surdu arguing against, following the footsteps of Kovac. Surdu's key arguments come with chapter 3 of his book. He explains also, it explains also the title of the publication, Those Who Count. He claims that the research about Roma in the last 2 decades uses social descriptors to depict Roma as an ethnic community. In this regard, both applied sociology and empirical studies strive to measure Roma ethnicity as independent variable. Therefore, quantitative research inevitably implies that Roma ethnicity is an object and measurable reality. Surdu concludes that there is a major gap and opposition between constructivist social theory of ethnicity and essentialist practice of applied sociology or empirical studies provided by census and surveys. This explains Surdu's critical reading of census and surveys that operate within the essentialist paradigm, a main instrument of reification, racialization, and stigmatization of Roma ethnicity. That is why he postulates, following the study of Ladany and Sheleny, to see Roma ethnicity as dependent variable. Surdu heavily criticizes the World Bank and UNDP surveys and samplings procedures that are manipulated and crafted, and for essentialist assumptions in their research. In consequence, World Bank and UNDP, in his view, reinforces stereotypical images and stigmatize Roma ethnicity as poverty-ridden and underdeveloped or somehow deviant group. Okay. Well, there are many things to say, so I am pushed to come to some conclusions about this book. But I think the main ideas I already said. But there is one point which I wanted also to indicate here and discuss. I personally was curious to know why and in what sense Surdu is devoting attention to the genetic studies in the context of Romani Studies, census and surveys, data and analysis. The case studies number 3 reveals both his motivation for studying it and the way he is approaching it. In essence, genetic studies, both medical and population genetics, serve Surdu's arguments raised against essentialist approach to Roma, documented in academia and in applied sociology. He is uncovering genetic studies biases, both related to the circular or tautological reasoning regarding Roma genetics, treatment of Roma as a population isolate, unchanged, originating from India, prone to endogamy, etc. He critically assessed this practice as following. In order to choose a genetic isolate as an object of study, such a population must be postulated a priori as an isolate, with arguments of endogamy and geographical separateness. And then it must be reconfirmed a posteriori through genetic research as a biologically unitary and consistent entity. What is pertinent here is trade-off of the genetic studies do to support their views, rely on ethnographic data regarding endogamy and those descriptions of Roma culture that are essentialist in nature, and do data and how they do interpret this data in genetic samples, relying on untrusted and politically guided estimates, yes, provided by census or surveys. So anyway, he's using genetic studies to compromise a little bit the essentialist approach to Roma. As a conclusion, I would like to recall here a situation I was confronted with when I entered the university, Jagiellonian University in Poland, in Krakow in 1974. Soon after I entered it, I realized that I am the first who get there from small Roma community. Later that I am the only one from entire Roma minority in Poland at the Jagiellonian University. How I came to know that? Well, I traveled across the world, Poland. I was meeting with many Roma communities. I was doing research among Roma. I was asking my friends at universities in Poland. Later on, I was publishing. Therefore, if therefore a survey, which he is strongly criticizing, concludes that majority of Roma have no higher education and few have higher education, and there is a problem with those who finish even primary education, is this a false or stigmatizing fact about reality which exists out there? One thing is to arrive to some data about the reality, and the other is to interpret this data. And in this sense, some interpretations of data of the World Bank surveys or UNDP studies may be questioned and may be stigmatizing, but the realities out there and eventually surveys in some way reflect on that. The second example from Poland relates to the police and its data. I have studied the data collected by the police about Roma during the communist period. At least for Poland at that time, there were no other data produced or collected than the police data. To some extent, these data are, let's say, trustful, because I'm referring here to his parts of the book where he's saying we are trusting something like a police data which are by definition untrustful. So I'm just saying that there were no other data at the communist time in Poland but police data, and that they were somehow can be trusted because majority of Roma were easily distinguishable at that time. In 60s, police collected over 10,000, or they registered over 10,000 Roma who were traveling at that time with horses and wagons. They were registered by police, accompanied by representatives of local authorities and party members. Of course, we can say this still can be biased, but there were not only police on the spot. And the other part of the Roma community, which I belong to, was settled, but visibly marked in the space of the village or outskirts of the cities. So it was not difficult to identify who is Roma, who is not Roma at that time. And of course, majority of us, both those nomadic and both those in villages, used a Romani language as a key marker. So this is additional reminder to any generalization that pose a danger of being a false. At least in the case of Poland, what I can testify, what Surdu is saying about the police and so on and data may not be true. In the case of Poland, I prove otherwise. So I would like to finish here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the very important speech. I propose that we move on to the next two speakers and then we open up for discussion. The next speaker is Carol Silverman from the University of Oregon, where she is a professor of anthropology. She has been involved with Romani culture for over 40 years as a researcher, teacher, activist, and performer. Her research focuses on Roma in Bulgaria and Macedonia, as well as the American and West European diaspora. Her research explores the intersection of politics, music, human rights, gender, and state policy with a focus on representation.
So today I'm going to explore the issues of method and positionality. I have to say it's a great honor to be on this panel with such distinguished Roma as a non-Roma. And indeed, I'm using my own roles as a non-Roma researcher, activist, and performer to show how necessary collaboration and advocacy are, but how challenging their implementation actually is. Now, of course, Ian Hancock reminded us, and Professor Brooks reminded us more recently, that all representations of Roma were constructed by non-Roma, and Roma exercised no control over these descriptions, images, whether scientific, artistic, or literary. This is finally changing. So the span of my work illuminates profound changes informing both theory and practice, and after reviewing these theoretical trends, I'm going to examine some examples from my career that are both successful but mostly unsuccessful, because I believe an honest evaluation of positionality is eminently necessary to interrogate both claims of truth and of advocacy. Non-Roma must examine how their privileged access to authority affect Romani issues. Furthermore, collaboration demands accountability to Romani communities and individuals who might not even agree among themselves. Thus, non-Roma are particularly need to cultivate sensitivity to listen and learn, and these are full-fledged, challenging efforts. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about collaboration and advocacy, but the theoretical threads that I'm pulling together are actually from feminist theory, because feminists were the pioneers in actually dismantling the idea of privilege and exclusion, also indigenous studies and anthropology, the discipline I'm in. So if we look at some of these quotes, first from feminist anthropologist Kamala Viseshwaran, if we've learned anything about anthropology's encounter with colonialism, the question is not really whether anthropologists can represent people better, but whether we can be accountable to people's struggles for self-representation and self-determination. Another scholar, Linda Smith, from the New Zealand Maori tradition, in her book Decolonizing Methodologies, talks about whose research is it, whose interest does it serve, and then in my own field, anthropology, under the rubric of public anthropology engagement, many other words I'll get to in a second, knowledge for whom and for what purpose. So today I feel strongly that collaboration with Roma is essential to my work, but that wasn't always true because I started out in the 1970s, and although, for example, in my university, there was not even one class on gender or women, I started the first class at the University of Oregon on the anthropology of women. We were out in the streets demonstrating against Vietnam, so there was this disconnect between what was happening in the university and what theories we were using. So I'm using Haraway's concept of situated knowledge, and that means that knowledge emerges from particular positionalities that are informed by hierarchies. And non-Roma can help to dismantle structural inclusion first by realizing that they're part of the system of privilege, and then by helping to dismantle exclusion. And yet this is very, very challenging. Now, in anthropology, there are quite a number of concepts that we've used in the last 10 to 20 years. The words engagement, activism, the rubric public anthropology, the words participatory action research, which presumes you are actually starting your projects with people on the ground for the goals that they identify with you. Yet there are many, many challenges about this. So public anthropology embraces the idea of critique paired with collaboration. And activist scholarship presumes that both the goals and the methods of research will be mutually developed by scholars and communities, thus leading to collaboration. So for anthropology in my field, we would need to actually parse out every particular phase of the research to figure out what our positionality is, not just the research, but the goal, the planning, methods, products, whether they are texts, whether they are exhibits, festivals, whether they are policy work, which audiences are we writing for, academic audiences. And again, we must, those of us in universities must remember that universities are part of our frameworks, and even our social justice work may be co-opted or recruited by universities for their legitimacy, even though you may not agree with the values of your university. So these are implications we all have to face if we're in universities. And then finally, the effects of our research. If we're measuring things, how can we even measure successes or not? So in looking at some of the challenges here, I've looked at quite a few, how could I say, roundtable discussions in anthropology recently, dissecting how collaboration actually looks on the ground and what are its successes and failures. So Weiss, an anthropologist, reminds us that, quote, in different contexts, when we take for ourselves the arrogant role of assisting others who may not want our help, or when we assume that they have much to learn from us, but we have nothing transformative to learn from them, then we reproduce the divisions between anthropologist informant or expert object that collaboration is intended to undermine. End quote. So I believe that humility, awareness, and sensitivity are sorely needed. I agree also with others in this roundtable discussion recently who underlined that examining the actual conflicts within engaged work can help us learn from experience. Osterweiler writes, quote, fictional frictional or conflictual moments can become important sites of collaborative knowledge production, even if at the time that collaboration feels more like conflict than co-laboring. We also have to watch out for what I'm calling the savior syndrome. Melissa Checker, an environmental anthropologist, talks about, quote, the academic superhero, able to scale vast configurations of power with a single email? Obviously not, okay? And even identifying what is social justice is really important. Okay, so now to some specifics. Looking at the chronology of my own projects from the 1970s, you can actually see a mirror of some theoretical trends. When I started my work with Calderas Roma in the US, this was basically a documentation and analysis project. I used the word gypsy, for example. I was not thinking of collaboration, but I actually realized that collaboration was happening because an elder woman, grandmother in the family I lived with, told me, don't ask any questions, you'll just learn everything. Believe me, I'll help you. Because I was a naive graduate student thinking I had to get through my checklist of questions. So I'll just go through these a little bit more slowly with some slides. But you can see I've worked in a number of places on a number of issues, some of which are obviously advocacy and some of which are more about culture and music, but have led to collaboration and advocacy. And I will say that if I look at this as a kind of overall project, I'd say that one thing that was an important lesson for me was that long-term research really does matter and comparative research really matters. So both of these were causing me to pay attention to specificity and historical particularism, to borrow a word from Franz Boas, meaning that I'm looking at specific times that are the product of history and then comparing across groups. And this has led me to be very reluctant to ever generalize and certainly not to exoticize and essentialize. Okay, so just a few pictures to show you my positionalities. So in the 1970s, when I was with Calderas Roma, I was actually looking quite a lot at gender, at the taboo system, at work patterns, at ritual, and so on. And again, very little had been written at the time. Rena Gropper's book had just come out, Anne Sutherland's book had just come out, and we felt like we were gathering materials. We didn't pay that much attention to method and positionality, okay? I was also very interested in music from the very early years, also ritual, and so many of these, how can I say, entrances into Romani culture were about documentation and analysis of various roles and positionalities of Roma themselves. My own trajectory from somebody who was outside of the family and then brought in as a tutor, as a cleaning lady, as an extra person in the house to help out was also, I did write about it even then. So there was this sort of early element of what I would call reflexivity, but not really theoretical engagement. I was very interested in economics at the time, which of course did lead to an analysis of where is money going and who has the power over it. So I was interested in power issues, but I would say from a kind of graduate school, you know, how does a theory I read apply in a kind of naive way. So my first politicization and advocacy came out because I switched to Balkan research in a very politicized atmosphere in socialist Bulgaria, where Romani instruments were outlawed, such as the zurna, and Romani musicians went to jail for playing them. So whether I wanted to or not, I had to pay attention to this and then brought it into my research. This entire genre of wedding music that is a combination of jazz and rock music and Bulgarian folk music was prohibited in the 1980s. And people went to jail, their instruments were confiscated, and they were used as examples on television of rowdy hooligans against socialist society. So whether I liked it or not, I was then involved in politics and trying to not only expose the injustices in the West, and I published some articles before the fall of communism and was threatened with not getting any more visas to go to Bulgaria. But the other part was actually promoting the music in the West. That is, if they can't play it in the East, then at least they can play it in the West. So my roles as tour manager, booking agent, vocalist as well, writing program notes emerged from this actual fieldwork situation. So album notes and bringing over musicians, fighting for asylum cases. Yuri Yunakov was the first Bulgarian musician to win asylum based on political persecution, and I was his translator and consultant in New Jersey court. And then I also became a performer with the group, and later on I'll talk about the positionality of actually performing. And this continues actually today. This is one way I feel that activism is really important in terms of using music to get people's attention and then focusing their attention on the musicians' lives, which are absolutely illuminating. I also worked in Macedonia from the late 1980s with groups of Muslim Roma in various cities, mostly in Skopje area, and focused again on ritual, but I, of course, could not help noticing the formation of Macedonian Romani parties, the first parties. So I was lucky enough to be on the ground for about 9 months detailing this and associating with cultural rights, which are very important in this large settlement outside of Skopje, Shutka. And then I was able to compare with families who had come from Macedonia to the United States. They had been coming since the 1960s, and they actually are in the neighborhood I grew up in Bronx, New York, so I've had this relationship for many years. So migration then became a topic, and of course it is a very politicized topic, and there are many services that non-Roma can offer in relation to migration, legality, understanding policy that I have served. I'd also like to talk about reciprocal ethnography, which I have tried somewhat successfully. Reciprocal ethnography is a word used by Elaine Lawless to mean sharing your actual analysis via text and having various collaborators comment on it, and then you would include that. And I did this with my book, but unfortunately, Roma are working class people in New York City and in Macedonia and Bulgaria, don't really have the time. I couldn't translate the entire book into various languages, but I did get feedback from quite a number of people and tried to include it as well. The other thing I've tried to do is follow the lead of Macedonian Roma women in New York, where they were suggesting that I shouldn't pay attention to music so much and I should focus more on their educational successes to be a counteraction of the stereotype of musical Roma, end of the story. So I have done that, and I had hoped to actually co-author some articles with these young women, all of whom you see here have higher education in New York City. Tremendous change just in one generation. But that's not happening because, again, people are too busy, but I still have hopes. And finally, I have 2 more examples of legal work. Again, I worked with Kalderash in New York, and then when I moved to Oregon, I did pick up this work with Roma communities from some of the same families, actually, that I know in New York. And I wanted to mention 1 or 2 examples. This was a case in unfortunately, an elder fraud, meaning that a Romani woman did swindle a non-Romani person out of quite a lot of money, and I was called in as a cultural witness. So this family, Rita Ephraim Zico, born and married this man. They had 6 daughters, and when their youngest daughter was 14 years old, the parents signed over their house to them, this really nice house. And unfortunately, that younger daughter did become the stereotype, meaning she did commit elder fraud. She served jail time. She reformed herself. She is out of jail and getting an education. And then there were many other civil cases against the Romani family for damages and for assets. So the house became the question. Should the wronged parties also get the house? And me as a cultural witness, we were trying to argue many, many things that despite negative publicity about Roma all over America and everywhere, there were cultural issues involved in why the house was in this 14-year-old daughter's name, who had now grown up to be a thief. So we used the actual, how can I say, essentialist argument to help Roma, even though in my entire work I have fought against this. But in the legal courtroom, this was the thing that actually won the case. We had to show that Roma are very different, that they have their own culture, they do not conform to American culture, and that the elder couple signed the house over in order to assure their security in old age, because they had no sons and they needed that daughter to take care of them in their elderly years. We talked about things like the marime system, and I was on the stand, and all of a sudden we had a cross-examination that brought up one of my articles, okay, from 1982, which came back to haunt me. So this is an example of what you write exists forever, and the terminology and exactly the argument may not be what you think it's going to be in the future. So the prosecuting attorney said, well, Professor Silverman, you actually wrote in 1982 in your article, Everyday Drama, Impressionment of Urban Gypsies, that gypsies perform their roles for social service agencies and truant officers. Well, don't you think this is a performance right now in the classroom, that Mrs. Ephraim is acting like a victim, but she probably committed insurance fraud, and this whole thing is just a performance. I was able to turn this around by telling the judge and the assembled people there that performance theory is actually wider than just applying to Roma. It applies to this courtroom where the judge is sitting there with his black robes and we're calling him Your Honor, and he's behind a wooden platform, and there's all kinds of dramatic roles going on. The judge loved this. He wanted to know all the references for courtroom staging, and I gave it to him, and the point died, thank God, then. But we do have to remember that our words come back to haunt us. So the judge did rule in our favor, and the appeal was denied, and the house is still in Rita's hands. And I just want to mention one more thing, and I'll close. When I was doing music research, I was asked to be the educational coordinator of the Gypsy Caravan, a festival of Roma music and dance from 1999. It was the first North American tour of 6 groups of Roma. And it was quite a big deal. And I got an angry call from an American Romani musician, an activist, saying, why are you going to be the educational coordinator? My group is not represented there. He was from an urban Slovak musician group, and all of those groups are from peasants, and they don't know how to read music, and you're not Romani, and what is going on? Why did you choose those groups? Well, first of all, I explained to him that I didn't choose the groups. There was a production office and so on. And I said, really, you know, if you feel like you could be you'd like this role, I'll absolutely talk to the producers. So I did talk to the producers, but I also made a phone call to Ian Hancock, who had known my work and who's an American activist and scholar. And I said, well, I'm thinking of resigning because I actually feel very conflicted about being in this activist, this advocacy role, being non-Romani. And Ian told me, I will take care of talking to my Romani friend. He's actually working out some of his dealings with Jewish people as a result of his being appointed at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Board after conflicts with many Jewish people you should stay in that role, I will deal with this. And this taught me about wider frameworks that you really need to consider that you may not even know about, and that Roma are dealing with themselves that you may be privy to or not. So in general, I think it's important to have a lot of humility in whatever role you have as a non-Romani scholar or activist. There's much that you don't know, even about the thing you think you know. So I did end up being the educational coordinator, and I had to deal with many other things, such as imagery like this for our tour, get in touch with your inner gypsy, the word gypsy, the fires, the passion. It was a very difficult role. And the last thing I just wanted to mention very briefly is my project on cultural appropriation, about costuming, Halloween costumes, music, food, the word gypster, which is gypsy and hipster, gypsy crunch cereals, gypsy sport, fashion houses with no Roma, gypsy music festivals with no Roma, but yet I also sing Romani music. So do I think that Roma culture only belongs to Roma? I would say that it's very complicated. Non-Roma have a place, but it depends on the respect you give, the credit you give, the type of history you have, and also what you're doing for Roma that you work with. So I'll just end with this Voice of Roma Herdelezi festival that just recently happened, an organization I've been involved with that is run by Roma, and we do music festivals to educate mostly non-Roma in America about Romani issues, but all our musicians are Roma, or mostly Roma, and we try to use music as a way to increase visibility so that we can get into issues of musicians' lives and the positionality of them and how they are dealing with issues of exclusion and inclusion, even being stars, because after the show, they too face exclusion and many other forms of prejudice. So I will conclude here, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I propose that we move on to the last speaker, and then we have two discussants. We are privileged, and then we open up the floor. So the last speaker is Ciprian Necula, who holds a PhD in sociology at the National School of Political Science and Public Administration from Bucharest, where he is now a teacher in 2 master's programs in gender and minorities and Romani studies. As many of you know, he served as a state secretary at the Romanian Ministry of European Funds. But for most of us, he's just an outstanding activist scholar, so it's really a privilege to have you here. And microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be again in this context where we can discuss in such a critical manner without getting upset. I was in politics for a while, 2 years, and I know that it's different there. And I will start with that because what Carol just said has to do with something what I thinking of. Your words may come back to you and hunting you, yeah? Hunt you. Actually, I was with the Prime Minister when I got the position of State Secretary in the Romanian government, and I was with EU funds dealing, but also had responsibility on Roma. I was the contact point for Roma, and I was leading the interministerial group on Roma inclusion. Yeah? And I had a discussion with the Prime Minister saying, okay, let's change the strategy. It's, too social, too. I said, but look, I was reading, and Roma issue, actually, it's a social issue. It's nothing to do with ethnicity. It's not about ethnicity. It's about poverty. We have to deal with poverty, We have to intervene that, and the labor, and market, and the school, and education, and the housing, and all these ideas that we hear often about Roma. And I told him, so how you get to this point? So I was looking to studies. And he called me, somebody. I will tell you later who called me. I just him, but why do you think that this is happening? I mean, why Roma, are in this condition? Why Roma? We say, well, I don't know, maybe because they are Roma. So they are poor because they are poor? Let's clarify. No, because they are different. What that means? Give me to read, he needed more readings on that. And actually, yeah, what we say, what we publish, and our facts is going to follow us for a long time. And not only us, but the people that we are writing for. And that's a problem, actually, with Romani studies that I tend to call, to some extent, gypsyology. And I invent this term because I rather prefer it for some Roma, not Roma, but let's say scholars that are writing a Roma. They're promoting an image of Roma in a way that actually affects Roma communities for a long, long period of time. And just to give an example, I start my paper with that. In Romania, I will refer to that, I will give my examples from Romania, especially because I live in Romania, I'm from Romania. You know, we started with our history as Roma in Romania started with slavery. Probably the longest history of slavery in the world, 500 years. And there are some scholars actually argumenting, scholars at that level, yeah, 14th century to 18th century, mentioned that this is actually the best way to pay to the Turks empire the debts, the Romanian debts, you know, enslaving as many as possible gypsies. Okay, but then also Romanian intelligentsia abolished the slavery. And they abolished it not because of the Roma, but because of the modernist idea. How can you be, you know, a modern state having slaves? So they had a contribution, abolish slavery. Very nice. Then, you know, it was another very interesting period in Romania where NGOs show up in between the war period. You know, NGOs show up, publication, newspapers. It was an association of Roma, actually more than one, but one with 100,000 members that were paying a fee every year. You know, quite strong movement, also supported by Romanian intellectuals and Roma intellectuals at that time. And we had also the other part of the coin, which is the eugenistic Romanian intellectuals that were more powerful. And actually they convinced the government that Roma should be deported, not to say killed. They had a contribution to that. And it was, you know, academia. These guys were high-level teachers, professors in the universities. Also running the Institute for Study, you know, Population Official Institutions of Romania. Then we had the assimilation policies in Romania during the communism. Well, that was based on a study in '77. It was a study done what to do with Tzigani. And the solution of that study was assimilation. Yeah. Later on, after the failure of the communism in Romania, we had the word for Roma was integration. We had, as you see, you know, various words. It was, in a positive way, let's say, emancipation, then it was, you know, assimilation, now integration. Integration also was based on a study of Cătălin Zamfir from '93 in Romania. So that's why actually the Prime Minister was quoting Cătălin Zamfir, saying this is the problem of Roma, not because they are but because they are poor, and they're only that. And now we are talking about inclusion. Shall we define inclusion what it is? Actually, all these, you know, policy names had a common question: what to do with Roma? And this is the ideological answer to what to do with Roma. Assimilate them, kill them, integrate them, include them, whatever, emancipate them. And always this was in the control of the others. Never, I mean, Roma contribution to that were as subjects mostly. There is a nice picture during the pro-Nazi government in Romania with the Roma leader from that time sitting with some Nazi researchers measuring, you know, noses and hands of Roma, and he was helping with that because he thought that it's you know, for a good reason. But they had a contribution too on that. Okay, I'm looking in a critical perspective to a question that also Andrei raised, also Ethel raised, also Julius raised. What is Roma? Finally, what is Roma? And I'm not asking this question like, what is Roma? But I'm going to the perspective of Andrei earlier. Why am I Roma? What makes me Roma? And this is not my question, it's Nicolae Gheorghe life dilemma. Nicolae Gheorghe, maybe you know about him. He was a Romanian Roma sociologist, activist, acting also as a public officer to OSCE for a while, but probably one of the most known and appreciated Roma intellectual. And this is, I will tell some stories actually, because I was working with Nicolae Gheorghe for 15 years, and I had the chance to, to hear a lot from him, and also to record, because he was asking always, can you record this discussion? We were in a car traveling. Can you record that? Because he hoped that somebody will come and publish what he never had a time to publish, being busy with activists, going to conflicts, and going to conferences on policies. He never had time to really write his opinion. He has some text, I will tell you about it, but not enough. And when he was, like 14, he was traveling with another Romanian in Transylvania by bike, and he was asked suddenly by a Romanian peasant, drunk a bit, "De ce ești tu țigan, mă? Why are you a țigan?" And he was shocked. He didn't know how to answer to that. First of all, how that guy recognized him as a, țigan or Roma. Secondly, why he has to answer to that. And why that person asked that question. And it was a question that haunting him all his life, looking for an answer. Well, I will tell you a bit about his way of becoming, because also he said, okay, if I'm Țigan, that in Romanian, and here's a method of denomination of what to use for Roma: Țigan, Gypsy, Roma, and other denominations. Țigan is rather, in the Romanian dictionary, is described, it was described, it's changed now, but I will tell you the first definition, and then I will tell you what has changed. As a dark person with a bad habits. That means that if you are Țigan, you don't belong to an ethnic group. You are just a criminal or whatever, and you have dark skin. So people will recognize you by that. Dark skin, and then how you act, and they will project you in a way. So it's rather a social projection of the others, of what Roma is. It's more behavioral. Roma NGOs were fighting with that, with Academia, Romanian Academia, and they changed it. Well, in a big way. Now it's pejorative, dark person with the bad attitudes. But at least we know that it's pejorative. So first of all, how we refer to Roma? It's also some gypsyologists, also notes, footnotes, explain that, look, this is how my informants were telling me that they were called Țigan, so I'm using their self-denomination. But does this researcher that writes about Roma knows that, history of that person or that group, how they came to this? For instance, in Romania, and I'll tell you some of my history now, my grandmother couldn't speak anymore Romani language. And she couldn't speak Romani language because their parents decided not to speak because they were afraid to be deported. Why that? Because in 42 we had a study in Romania identifying who's speaking Romani, who's Roma. And the language was the criteria for that. And they were deported based on that. So they decided not to speak Romanes anymore, not to teach their children to speak that because it's dangerous. And also not to answer to the census and to questionnaires like that. And I will tell you why later on, because I have two slides that I will refer to as a critic. Oh, so fast? My God. That's introduction only. Okay, then I will go quickly. Okay, Nicolae ended his way of becoming Roma in an event that I attended, and it's written in my article, you will see it, and it's public, to be public, hopefully, is that he went back to Trouble family, which is the family that he learned Romanes. He was spending, as a researcher, first of all, some years, and learned actually how it's another Roma community that identifies itself as a Roma community. Because, as you know, we have diverse Roma communities, and that's an effect of the Romanian policy in Romania. Is the effect of the slavery. Roma being split for 500 years, develop different cultures, interaction, we identify ourselves by our name, by professional name. I'm a blacksmith family, Nicolae was a musician family, combined with blacksmiths too. There are many other groups, 16 groups that we have in Romania, divided by their own traditional occupation. So getting back to what I'm saying, in the last New Year Eve party of Nicolae, he asked me, what are you doing on this vacation? I said, well, partying. He said, well, let's party together while talking about Roma nation. I said, oh my God. And we were going to Sibiu, to Csaba's family, where he learned, in the first place, Romani language and, was getting closer to that specific group of Roma Căldărași. And I'm not, due to the time, I will skip a lot of things. Unfortunately, they are very, nice. Hope you really are going to read that article because I'm telling that story. But essentially is that he was asked by the Căldărași community, by Csaba, which is the king, the priest, the judge, and everything there. He passed away also in 2013. He was asked to be baptized as a Christian, as a no-Protestant Christian. Nicolae was an atheist. He said, we were in the church, I was really curious what's his answer. And he said, I will do it. I was stunned, like, man, this is an atheist. How he changed his mind so quickly. And then I discovered it was a process. He wanted an intimate process only with the Csaba family. He was baptized in the religion of the community. Say, that was my last act of becoming a Roma from this community. It was a political decision to be baptized in order to be a Roma of that specific community. And he was recognized after that as a brother in, as a Roma brother in ethnicity, of course, and religion, which became something very important for the specific community. And why I'm telling this, because identities are very fluid, but yeah, it's not something stuck there. This is how Roma looks like. And you'll find them in Hungary the same. They interact with other groups, and they change. And again, for Nicolae, this was his last act of becoming a Roma. Of course, next year, both of them, Csaba and Nicolae, passed away, and unfortunately, this story has to be, developed, and we should talk more about it because it's really fantastic what that person did to Roma as a group. Okay, now I'm getting to. I have 5 minutes now. I gotta quickly go through this. Unfortunately, I spent too much time on this introduction. But I was looking on Martin Kovac's an article about choice to be made and prices to be paid, potential roles and consequences of Roma activism and policy making, where Nicolae was also publishing a text. And I was stunned to discover that, first of all, Roma doesn't exist, as Surdu's theory as well. It doesn't exist because they don't have a language. Roma language doesn't belong to Roma. This is what I'm quoting now from my memory, but I can also quote like this text. Kovacs. So only 15 and 25%, he says, speaks Romanes. That means that Roma language is not, the basis of Roma identity. Okay. Well, I argue that here that also Belarusian can speak only 10% the Belarusian language, but they are still Belarusians. Anyway, we don't do that with the Belarusian. Then he didn't say that Roma doesn't have a culture, but he said it has so many cultures that actually there is not a Roma culture. What is, Roma from cultural perspective? And of course, he argued that nothing. Here, Nicolae had a nice, contradiction to him, saying maybe the feeling of belongings of Max Weber, something that probably is common to all Roma, and cultural practices like, okay, purity and pollution, What about this? Anyway, so Roma doesn't really have a culture, they don't have a language. Geographically, as they're not in the same spot, they can have an identity. This is what Martin Kovac says. I mean, if you are a diaspora, that's a, or spread all over Europe, that's a vulnerability, not an opportunity as Nicolae and Andrei Mirga was identifying in '97 in their articles about transnational, nation or ethnicity. So it's rather a vulnerability, not what you or Andrei were saying. Hold on just a second, because I'm trying to, practices, of course. It was quite interesting to me to read it, and I really invite you to read Martin Kovac's text, because it's an example of what Gypsyologists are doing. So I'm quoting him now. the politicized Roma discourse has contributed to a close association between Roma and lifestyle occupation. This reflects not the circumstances of all Roma people, but rather mainstream institutional interest. So what he means, I mean, he was talking about practices here and occupations. I mean, not all Roma has the same practice and occupation, but that Hungary has the same occupation. What that will be? What he means by that? So we don't have an identity because, you know, it's this situation that we are having various occupation practices. It would be boring without it, yeah? Physiognomy. He's also talking about, you know, the way how we look like. And he said, okay, there are dark-skinned Roma, but also white-skinned Roma. So there is not, you know, a single physiognomy that we can identify as Roma. Great. I wouldn't comment on that too much. Self-identification, and this is again interesting, and I'll finish with Kovacs because I really invite you to read his text. He finally recognized something, you know, as a possible basis of the Roma, for the Roma discourse is self-ascription, how people identify themselves. And then he came back and said, however, this might seem fundamentally subjective. I mean, how I identify myself is subjective. How he is identifying myself is objectivity. It's scientific, rather. Okay. And then I look into another study, and I will finish with that quickly. It's about gypsyologists, as I'm calling them, and heteroidentification. I mean, there is a study now just finished in Romania, done by Institute for Studying National Minorities in Cluj, with a budget of €1 million. It was a cartography, basically, you know, mapping, socio-Roma map is called, of Roma communities. And they discovered great things, like the number of Roma in Romania, similar to a study from a year and a half ago with zero budget, done by the Ministry of European Funds that I was working to myself. What they did a campaign letters to the local administration, you know, mayors, health mediators, local councillors, asking what are the Roma communities there. And they collect data, put them in a nice presentation map. They are beautiful, you know, with colors and, you know, it's very beautiful as a presentation. And they told us where Roma lives, what are the communities, and so on. From whose perspective? Actually, is that Roma communities, or it's a representation of Roma communities of local authorities and administration? And is that? That study costs that much and is going to influence public policies on Roma, ignoring actually other Roma communities, because how we see Roma as a poor community. And that's actually the dilemma. Who's constructing the narratives of what is Roma? And the role also of Roma leadership, NGOs, scholars into that, unfortunately, is not there. And probably Roma has to fight more. He give me a minute more. Has to fight more for their own projection and discourses. And also as a political construct, because Kovacs is also mentioning that here in his article, that it's a construct of activist Roma ethnicity. I say, okay, maybe it is a political construct of activists, but tell me a single ethnic group or nation that is not a political construct of somebody. Do you know that? I mean, according to Barturi and Brubaker and others, groups are political constructs. It's not about that. It's about self-determination of the specific group, that we are belonging to something that Martin Kovacs and ISPMN couldn't define. It's our ethnicity, and we embrace it as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciprian. What I suggest is that in five minutes, Julius Rostas and Ethel Brooks reflects on the three speeches, and then we open up for a discussion after these excellent speeches. Maybe you can use, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be very short to leave space for questions. However, a very brief comment on Professor Brooks' speech. I think she emphasized the need to decolonize the knowledge production on Roma as a way to move on with the development of Romani studies. I think that's a crucial point. if I would have to summarize the whole conference now, I identify this as a very clear aim. Then Andrzej Mirga raised some questions about the power to classify and categorize and inquire the consequences of these classifications and categorizations using Mihai Surdu's book for that. I think in that respect, he also pointed out the tensions between a more objective science and the more interpretative sciences when it comes to who is Roma and who is not. Professor Silverman was, in a way, making a testimony on her own work and engagement with Romani Studies for more than 40 years. And I found quite powerful the kind of self-reflections that I wrote down here. And I will try to cite some of them, that long-term research and comparison matters a lot. Reflexivity is something to pay attention to. Also, reciprocal ethnography, it's something to use. And that what we write matters. In fact, this is one of the standards that I am trying to evaluate some of the earlier scholars in Romani Studies. And to me, as a scholar, the standard is that in 30, 40 years, you should not be ashamed of what you wrote, before. I think that's pretty reasonable in that respect. So my friend and my colleague, Dr. Nekula, raised the very sensitive questions on what is the basis of Romani identity, using the example of our friend Nicolae Gheorghe. I think this is a very complex question that we cannot find, we cannot offer just brief answers. I mean, to me, Martin Kovacs was trying to simplify, to offer very simple answers to these questions, and I think he got it wrong in many aspects. For those that would like to read something about Nicolae's thoughts on the subject in Roma Rights, I don't remember now, in 2015, there is an interview I made with Nicolae back in 2011 on this issue, so you'll find much more. But that's one of the fundamental questions that I think for critical Romani studies will be a priority.
Thanks, Julius, and thanks to everybody on the panel. Again, I want you to have your coffee break and have time for conversation. So I'm not going to give individual questions, and also because I want other people to be able to do that. But what I really found interesting, this panel was, it ended up being a conversation, and not just a conversation where I was thinking how interesting it was that you have critiques of the teacher and the student with Kovacs and Surdu, but also a conversation around kind of what does positionality mean, what does identity mean, how do we understand these within different practices of knowledge production. And so I actually started to think a little bit about what it might look like methodologically within Romani Studies. And I think, we've got some elements, right? So Carol pointed out to this question of reflexivity and responsibility, right? Thinking about history and positionality and the co-production of knowledge. But it's also grounded in this kind of deep engagement with critique. That's that really opens up new ways of thinking about, or at least it opens up the possibility for a conversation. And I think that that ends up being something that's very new, and that becomes a different kind of possibility for Romani studies, because it does move away from the sites and practices of expertise that have really marked the field for so long. And in this way, right, the whole question of who the expert is, you could turn the question that Ciprian said was asked of Nicolae Gheorghe when he was 14, right, you know, why are you a gypsy, to, you know, why are you an expert? What makes people experts? And that can become a grounding for thinking about different kinds of methodological interventions, ones that perhaps eschew expertise, that try to think about the bases for producing knowledge, but also that really come out of, you know, notions of solidarity, of working together, of conversation, and of really understanding the political stakes that we actually are in the midst of, right? And so in that way, I guess that I want to get back a little bit to the question of identity, right? And whether it's constructed, whether it's not constructed, and to maybe bring forth a call for us to go back and think about Deleuze and Guattari, for example, and thinking about the notion sort of assemblage, but how it is that an assemblage, right, what they call in French a dispositif, consolidates power or concentrates power. Because, you know, in a lot of ways, right, we look around and we see, you know, the Roma, the non-Roma in the room. There are non-Roma in the room who speak Romanes, there are Roman in the room who don't, or who speak different kinds, right? And we think about the example of Nicolae Gheorghe's life and sort of what it meant sort of to become, right? Why are you a gypsy, but then to become Roma? And as that progress, or that process, right, is one that doesn't really depend upon a notion of authenticity or a kind of fixed notion of identity that sort of crosses time. And so, but it does depend upon a particular notion of power, right? Because as a 14-year-old, or for all of us, you know, and I'm sure that many of us in the room, the Roma in the room certainly, you know, there was always a moment when it's suddenly like, wait a minute, what are you and who are you and why, right? That kind of, that back and forth. And you know, I remember being maybe 7 years old and someone being like, what is a gypsy, and you live over there, and what does that mean? And being 7 and not really knowing how to answer that. And thinking about what that process of power is, the ways in which particular subjects and bodies are marked in certain ways, becomes a kind of a concentration or a power container that I think we have to really understand, right? So that's where things like police harassment, marginalization, lack of access to water, lack of access to land, violation of reproductive rights, all are something that they're violations of rights, they're assumptions of particular identities, and then they're also things under which, you know, people don't necessarily have control, but they certainly respond to. And so what I find interesting about that whole conversation about kind of around authenticity, right, that goes from 1888 when we see this, the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, to, you know, 2016 with Mihai Surdu's work, or, you know, earlier with kind of other people's work, that people fixate on the question of authenticity in order to avoid talking about power and privilege and redistribution. And that's academic redistribution, that's economic redistribution, right? But to really think about what goes into producing profit, academically, but also in everyday life in terms of land, right? I mean, so I could go, I said I was going to be really short, and now I'm just going on, and I'll stop. But maybe one of the ways in which we can do that is, for me, a text that I found really useful in thinking about this is Real Black by anthropologist John Jackson, where, you know, John teaches at Penn, right, at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a PhD from Columbia. He comes from Harlem. And what it meant to do your PhD, for him to do his PhD at Columbia University as an African-American working class kid from Harlem. And so he invents a superhero alter ego called, what's it called? God, I can't remember. He's got a, but it's beautiful. He's got a picture of him, right? Afro Man, I think he's called. And the only way that he can actually think about doing ethnography within the community that he grew up in is to take Afro Man as the alter ego and go in and start sort of talking to people, you know, in his community. And so really for us to think about identity in that way, like what does it mean? And what John then comes up with is this notion, a critique of authenticity and an argument for sincerity. So in some ways, I guess what we're coming into is through a recognition of the power relations, right? What it means to profit from a particular, and here I'm going to actually maybe turn some tables, right? Where Roma, my parents, you know, bred horses and peddled, right? Sold door to door for a living, right? That's how they made money. But, you know, what does it mean when we start to think about kind of the ways in which Romani Studies or gypsyology, gypsylorism in particular, has peddled certain notions of Romani identity, and how do we take that back? And I think one of the ways that we do that is to talk about authenticity as opposed to, or to critique authenticity and really claim sincerity. So those are just some of my thoughts. It was really just a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank everybody for their engagement as well, because it was exciting.
Thank you so much. And so now we open up for discussion. That's why we actually arranged the room this way. So please feel free to jump in and yeah. If we had microphone.
Well, I would just like to mention two crucial moments in Nicolae Gheorghe's life. But before, I would like to say also that not all Romanian dictionaries use this label of bad behavior and so on in both Romania and Moldova. In Poland, recently I saw this kind of definition in a brand new dictionary kind of 5 years ago. So we have to fight also there. And we have to fight also with Webster, in which the word to gyp has not been deleted, while to Jew has been deleted. But this was not my main point. These two crucial moments in Nicolae's life, who are symbolic also. Cyprian, you probably know them. The first was at the meeting, the Copenhagen meeting of the Helsinki process. With one short sentence, he changed the fate of our nation. I say this mainly for students and younger people. He managed to introduce in the final document the simple sentence, in this context, one has to take on account the fate of the Roms/Gypsies. This was very short, but this was the beginning. It was a key to open a huge door of a huge Europe or world. And the second crucial moment was in Helsinki at the CSCE. It was still the CSCE, not yet the OSCE. Nicolae had his speech, and he mentioned we the Roms, and so on. And he was interrupted by the Italian delegate who said, Mr. Gheorghe, I'm sorry to tell you, but Rome is the name of the city where I was born, and I don't allow you to use this word, this name for any people. And Nicolae continued his speech, but in the evening, we gathered, we were there with Nicolae Gheorghe, Rajko Đurić, as far as I remember, probably also Stankiewicz, and 2 or 3 others. We were sleeping in Tauto's house, apartment. Tauto was, he's dead now, was Finnish Rome. And we say that this is the first time that we face this kind of reaction from the floor, but maybe we will have to give answers later. And so we spent the whole night in thinking why do we use the word Rom? And then we understood one thing. that we had inherited the word and the notion of gypsy. We had just changed the label, the name, but we had not changed the meaning of the word. So it was a colonial type inheritage of a word with a meaning conveyed by the majority, by the mainstream society, and we were passively using the new word, but without thinking that this Italian helped us a lot because we spent the whole night, and finally we understood that nomadism is not a feature of the Roms, that poverty is not a feature, that so and so. All the dark skin is not a feature, to mention also not only Kovac, but many people, and so on. So finally, we understood that to feel a Rom is to feel that you are not a Gajo. And it's very important. And it's not so subjective. It is not so subjective. It is the meaning of the culture. And to have a language with apologizes to Kovac, if we don't speak, if some of the Roms, not 80% as he says, but 1/2 of the Roms don't speak Romani, but they all remember ancestors who spoke Romani. Directly, ancestors in the family or ancestors in the history, as in Spain. And in everyday speech, they all have a few words of Romani. And the third point was more scholarly. It was the Indian origin, which accounted for the language, for the culture. And diversity in culture is not specific to Roms. The Hungarians are also very diverse, not to say the Americans or the Jews or the Berber or any. Maybe the Fijians are not so diverse, or the Samoan on one island, but 90% of the nations are diverse. And the idea to emphasize the diversity of the Rom is also a kind of sabotage, I would say. But remember these two moments, I don't remember the dates, it was around 91, 92 in the Copenhagen, 91 meeting in Copenhagen, the Helsinki process. It was not yet CSCE and OSCE, and also the intervention of the Italian delegates in Helsinki. Thank you.
Introduction to your afternoon speech, Professor Curtia. Thank you. So, any other comments, questions? Or, yeah.
Well, I actually have a question to my father, which I think... and I think it also builds on the figure of Nicolae Gheorghe that was mentioned a few times already, because you were very close and you worked very close together with Nicolae for many years, but you came from very different backgrounds and from very different experiences of your Roma-hood, I'd say. So I wonder, because you produced together this seminal paper on the Roma in the 21st century, which is the basis of Roma, contemporary Roma thought, and there are a lot of mentions of what Roma identity actually is. And I was wondering whether there were any points of disagreement along the years when you were working together and actually producing this paper, and later on as well, of these conceptualizations of what actually it means to be Roma between the two of you.
Well, I think that we had before we started to write, and we had a good kind of a guidelines into the issues. Yes, because first of all, we were somehow taught by top specialists at that time on ethnicity. There was one of them was Donald Horowitz. And we met him in '92 when we were at the meeting in Czaszka Papierniczka near Bratislava at the conference, and there were several other top scholars from America on ethnicity. he was sociologist, I was anthropologist, so we were a little bit more eager to study and to learn about that. And after there was a Kona statement, which he produced together with us top scholars of PER, yes, where they were expressing the views on minorities, ethnicity, identity in the changing world, and so on. So I think we had a background. Good to enter into these issues. Regarding disagreements, I don't think that we were on different kind of positions here, because I believe we had a common understanding that Roma have to be what I was quoting here from Erickson, that you have to have both. Yes, you have to keep kind of a you cannot imagine identity that is infinitively changing. There is something core there, but at the same time it is adaptive, it is flexible, and you are constructing. Of course, it's the key is here the construction. Who is if I am constructing myself, yes, responding to the challenge, I accept that. If there is something imposed from outside, by power, by state, it is oppression. It is results eventually in something what Surdu surprisingly is noticing about Nazi Germany and South Africa apartheid policy, that power and colonialism somehow defines others, and it is a grave consequences in policy afterwards, yes, because it leads to apartheid or genocide as it was in this. But I believe for us important is to reflect on diversity and sameness, and that's what you mentioned here now, that we are diverse, but we are somehow also the same, yes, because we have our roots, we have our origin, we have our language, we have these indicators of identity, which are sometimes questioned or reduced to social markers. Yes, we are not social markers. Yes, we have our. So that's why I was saying, in anthropology, which is leads to reduce us to some social markers, we should be opposing, because we are not to be reduced to how we look like and what is our social position. Yeah. So we have to reflect on this diversity, which, in my view, we are more comfortable with diversity and we are more acceptable. We accept diversity within us because we are sitting here, all are different, and if you go to the communities in 90s, we were all gathering from entire Europe, from UK to Russia. We had no problem with that somebody is Muslim, somebody is Catholic, somebody is Protestant, that somebody speaks or doesn't speak Romani. We were fighting for a cause, somehow united, this regard. And on the opposite side is, and I can name several anthropologists who are obsessed with our diversity. And they are naming and categorizing us in every kind of a box, yes? We are professionally defined, yes? We are Kelderaj, we are Lovara, we are Beyash, we are something. How we can, out of this diversity, come to something like a unity? And based on that, like Kovac and Marushakova, whatever others, they are obsessed with this diversity among us. We are relaxed with diversity. They are obsessed. So how we can come together and cooperate if they are taking such a stance? So I think diversity, sameness, is one of the key areas which we should work on, explain a little bit to others, non-Roma scholars, what is our perception of this, and what is our view on this, and how it counters their perceptions and their views on that? Thank you.
Thank you. And what I suggest is that we have maximum 2 small questions from the floor. I saw Peter, I saw Marius, and then for a final round, I give you back the microphone, and then we go for a coffee break.
Thank you, Marci. So my question is related to identity and diversity. It seems to be important somehow to combine the identity of diverse Roma communities with a sort of double identity in the nation states communities where Roma people live. And I wonder, how do you see this, how this combination can be created best? And it's not necessarily easy, but to me at least, and I may be wrong, but to me at least it seems to be important, because without a strong overarching Roma identity, it would be such a pity not to have that. At the same time, if only that would be emphasized, then it could sustain what also appears in the vocabulary, how, for example, in Hungary, Roma people also often mentioned separately from Hungarians, which is total nonsense, because Hungarian Roma are Hungarian citizens, and as far as I know, most of them, or many of them at least, have a double identity, and they think they are Roma, European, Hungarian.
Thank you. And you had a question, and then I give back for a final round the microphone.
Thank you, Marci. Yeah, I think Surdu book, it's good that is discussed here. As all the books, no books, it's perfect. And the fact that imperfection of the book start a debate. However, I think that it should be read the book in a different view as well and perspective, because even from the title we have to say the ones who count, and I think the way how he actually put the power perspective, and he actually demonstrated that the methodology of the ones to count, just because of their power relationship, and he started from the anthropological point of view, then individual scholars that actually feed the development of policy till the so-called international bodies that did research on Roma. So majority of them, they have huge glitches in their methodological approach in defining, in counting, in measuring. And by the way, the case studies of World Bank, it's very relevant, because he took the methodology and spotted very well how actually shifting paradigm from ethnicity, from self-determination, and so on and so far, World Bank put it in a paradigm of poverty, of social problem, and problematizing the Roma both in countries and in Europe. However, he is coming with the argument, and he was very critical with some Roma that witnesses that processes, and actually they were either a little bit ignorant, or they were backing for the sake of power. And he also had a very interesting point there when he said that non-Roma scholars and Roma scholars, they are cited, the World Bank studies are the most cited our days. He did an analytical work on this, meaning that we agree with something that methodologically wrong, and nobody challenged before him this. And the last point, with the genetic, actually the chapter and the argument on genetics saying that even with the science that it's more precise and you have track words of it, because of the power, the genetician actually confirm it, or and built on stereotypes that were developed by anthropologists, by the so-called fluidity, a more interpretative part of the social sciences. The genetician came and actually they reinforced
something that was already methodologically biased and subjective and interpreted in a different note. However, indeed, into the book, maybe was there a language or some material mistake, but it doesn't mean that epistemologically the book didn't bring essential points for debate. Thank you.
Thanks. And now a final response, comments either concerning the question of Peter with dual identity or whatever you want to. We can start maybe this order with Ciprian, yeah.
Okay. Well, nice comments about Nicolae Gheorghe and about his contribution to what Roma is today. There is, sure, my short time to express his contribution was not enough. And there are already some books published about it, starting with 91, about his personal history with Sam Beck, and then till 2015, as far as I know, the European Roma Center publication with a collection of text, and others too. And yeah, his contribution was definitely important. But also, speaking about contradictions and disagreements, we had debates quite interesting, you know, about what he considered to be the most authentic Roma group. And he was referring to Căldăraș. And he was an instinct of exotism, probably from his anthropological perspective on Roma. Why that? Because, of course, anthropologists, I'm not criticizing it as far as you can see, but we're looking for what exceptional. You know, the primitives of Europe was the title of an article that I read about Roma. You know, so of course, there's a lot of marketing here as scholars and a lot of business around. When I say business, I just mentioned that €1 million study of ISPMN spent on letter campaigns to collect some data. But also there are many other projects that you might know that you know, makes scholars very wealthy in relation to Roma. The danger of that, it's what the Prime Minister just told me, that he knows about Roma is there, you know. So we construct actually scholars, a type of discourse that that we can't get out of it through, you know, methods that may prove, you know, scientific, but not in that complexity of what we call Roma diversity. And speaking about it, I just told you that, and I want to emphasize that Nicolae. Besides, you know, we know that we are Roma because we're not Gage. That's a matter of feeling of belonging that Roma has, no matter their, you know, let's say, assimilation level. And that's because a lot of Roma are stuck into policies of assimilation in the communist time, in Romania, for instance. They are considered Pisigan, they don't speak Romanes, and so on. But they know that they are different from Gage, and they know that they belong to Roma. Even if they want to hide that, but still, they have a feeling of belonging to this specific community. And it's something that actually cannot be measured just like that. It's something so intimate that people may not talk to various persons about it. And I can tell you, at the census, a lot of Roma did not declare themselves Roma for two reasons. First of all, it's why to declare that? We had an experience with 42 and we were deported based on that. And secondly, you know, why this Gage should know what I am, you know? I mean, I know what I am. What you should know that too. And speaking about diversity of what you mentioned, you know, diverse identities. Everybody has that. You know, I'm a Roma, I'm a fisherman, I was in politics, I also end up a bit in you know, academia. The fisherman is the most important identity to me, and so on. So we have various type of identity that we play, you know, within a specific context. I declare that I'm Roma here because it was relevant probably for this context, but otherwise when I'm fishing, I really don't say to the fish, I'm Roma, please come, you know. Enough of that.
Thank you. Well, I think trying to respond to your question about identity and multi-identities, yes, I think the concept of hyphenated identity, yes, can be more explored as an answer, yes, because we are all somehow hyphenated, yes, and we are part of the national community and of a ethnicity, of a minority. Yes. On the other hand, sometimes in these discussions about Roma by anthropologists, we can name a series of names here. Something is missed that when the law was adopted in a number of countries, who we are in the countries, yes? At the table where we were discussing with the government, Roma were sitting as a constituents, yes, constituency, and they were saying to the politicians how they would like to be named in the law and who they are. And this is sometimes missed in these all considerations. Hungary was, in Hungary, Roma didn't say we want to be a Roma. They agreed to have a gypsy, and in the original law from '93 there is a gypsy. And Beasz. In Poland, we were insisting, we are Roma, doesn't matter how you name us. And it was introduced in the law, and this is in the national minority law adopted. Yes? In a number of countries, in Sweden, everywhere, you have the term adopted and made legal. Yes? And we are a minority. The fact that we have hyphenated identities because of belonging, this double belonging, citizenship and minority belonging, should be explored and should be more kind of made visible. Regarding Surdu books and some of the arguments, I didn't get in favor of his epistemic writing, whatever approach. I'm critical against a book which in consequence leads to cancellation of me as a minority or member of the community which has a sense of who am I, yes? And I doesn't care who is classifying me, who is defining me, how they are situated in the power to impact or to impose something on me. I can understand this, that it is, yes, it plays a role, yes. But if somebody concludes that I am totally constructed by their classifications and so on, and I feel opposite, I disagree with that, yes. And there are several aspects which I had no time to discuss here, but will be written about, for example, this power relationship between Roma and the state, police, statistician institutions, and so on, who counts, and so on. He recognizes to some extent that there is a Roma who play a role in this, yes, and double role, as you said, sometimes supporting, sometimes opposing. But if he's writing about how Roma entrepreneurs, yes, evolved after '89, after when communists failed, and to not recognize, for example, the consequences of the Balkan Wars, yes, for Romani movement and for speaking out about discrimination in the new way, yes, and then migration with its causes, yes, and how war defines the borders or shapes divisions in society, who is who. It's a little bit a gross, let's say, mistake. The other thing, what I notice in the book is lack of comparative perspective. I was puzzled sometimes to see what is generally applying to all minorities and what is specific to Roma. he's using theories and applying to Roma. What about other minorities? For example, if he says that Roma do not trust census and they don't somehow uncover their identity, they hide their identity, and census is not trusted because it's led by state and so on, and this is always undercounted, whereas surveys overcount, estimate too much Roma, yes? And says that this is only the practice with Roma. From my experience, when I was in the office, we faced a situation with Macedonia, and our office was there, where the Albanian minority opposed to join the status commission, yes, to lead the census, because they were distrustful to the state and to this commission, yes? And they were requesting international community to come and to lead the process. So this is not only the attitude of Roma, and this kind of perspective is missing. Similarly with black movements, yes? When they are talking about these critical race theories, when they are starting from the legal aspects, go to the structural discrimination, this is absent. And in the book, for example, I was trying to check whether there is anything like anti-Gypsyism designed or talked or written about. This is a leading topic now with the EU, yes? We are forcing this, and this is absent in the book. So there are many points to raise about the book, how it is.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Let's give also for final comments for Ethel and Carol, and then Julius, if you have something. Yeah.
Thanks. I just had a couple of things today thinking about identity, and particularly in response to Peter's question. So Gayatri Spivak in an interview from 2007 gives a critique of identity, not kind of the older argument that she made about strategic essentialism, but rather her critique of identity goes, she calls it, well, she basically says that, yes, in fact, something has to be counterposed to the main outposts of power. And she said, you know, I'm uncomfortable with identity because it solidifies, it reifies all sorts of things, all the complexities that we've been talking about. But she says, in terms of the counterposition to the main outposts of power, perhaps the only thing you can really talk about is position. So, you know, her argument is, I can't speak from Latin America. I can't speak from Africa. I don't want to speak from Bengal or India or South Asia. But what I do want to do is to be able to take a position that's based in my own grounding, in what I grew up in and what I know. And so I was thinking about this, and I just want to give a quick anecdote, not an antidote. Well, it is an antidote. An anecdote. When I, you know, my family, my mother didn't go past 7th grade, right? My family, that generation, was kicked out of schools in the U.S. because they were gypsies. They weren't allowed to go after a certain point. And so, you know, I was the first person to go to university. So I went to university. I went to a very elite, small liberal arts college in Massachusetts, where there was a small kind of section of Romani Studies books on the shelf, including Carol's work, which was exciting to me as an 18-year-old. And then, you know, but just thinking about that whole thing, and I took them all out, or I sat in the library and I read them, and I spent sort of this, you know, in this very particular corner of the library. But then my freshman year, my first year, when I came home for Christmas, after having been away, I thought that we were doing it all wrong, that my community was doing Romaniness all wrong. So, right, I covered my head, and I hadn't grown up covering my head, and I put a long skirt on. And I walked into sort of the family, you know, and I was like, and you know, I'm 18, and I really need to be married now. So my cousin, So there's my cousin Eddie. He's very cute. Like he's my cousin. No, just think about all the things that I was saying, right? I really want to marry my cousin Eddie. And she's like looking at me and she's like, okay, why are you wearing these clothes? And my aunt is around, like the whole family sort of is staring at me, right? And what are you doing? And what is this place, Williams College, where you've been? What are they teaching you, right? And I was like, oh well, this we don't do it right. And they looked at me. My aunt looked at me, right? Everyone's sort of staring at me, and they're like, if we don't know, and she, deliberately using, if we don't know who gypsies are and what we do right, who else knows? And, and everybody's sort of like, so, right, exactly. So this was sort of like this moment where I was like, oh my God, I am really an idiot, right? So that kind of, that Romani kind of culture and what that means becomes something that we really can't, we can't embrace an identity that doesn't have a position. And so really for us to think about our position, to think about authenticity, but also to remember, what it means to come from where we come from, in whatever way that means, is the position that we should be taking. And then to say, in terms of what Peter was asking, it's also a politics, right? Again, going back to Spivak, counterposed to the main outposts of power. So it becomes a political practice. Because, there's a political practice in hiding, which again is a survival mechanism, not filling out census, not doing these things. But the position that we take becomes one that is political. And for me, that position as a feminist, as a Romani, as a Romni, as a leftist, right, as a critical person, and as an academic, as an activist, right, is one that is a position that is my political position, that is counterposed to the main outposts of power.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the issue of identity politics and social constructionism, because this is actually not a new issue in the world. And we have to, I think we can learn from some past experience with this. I mean, I'm thinking of how to balance a healthy critique of essentialism and expertise categories with identity politics, which is the way the world works, where you have groups that somehow have something in common and are looking for power or rights, okay? So in the 70s, when social constructionism was introduced in anthropology, there were huge debates, especially in Pacific Island societies. The work of Jocelyn Linnekin, who was criticized as deconstructing Hawaiianness exactly at the time when land rights were the issue and ecology. Roger Keesing also worked in Pacific societies. Alan Hansen, who worked with the Maori and was accused of, again, deconstructing Maori-ness, the exact time when Maoris wanted their language revived and their culture and their visual systems of adornment and so on. So we have to realize that these exercises like Surdu can actually be used in really different kinds of ways that he may not even envision. So our actual academic exercises are part of politicized discourses. We can never really lose that, and we have to remind ourselves all the time. Now, on the other hand, I do believe that we need to have a healthy critique of essentialism and authenticity, but also that has to come from groups that differ among themselves. Andre mentioned that intellectual Roma have no problem with diversity, but I've been with Romani communities that do have problems of intermarriage and so on. So again, how do we balance who's speaking for diversity or authenticity, or who's Roma? These are very thorny issues, but I think if we identify them and then find our positions in them, it'll be a lot easier to kind of move forward. It's a lot easier to criticize what not to do than actually what to do. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Julius, you have final comment? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe just to say that the discussions here emphasize what recently Roger Brubecker's published an article, I think in New York Review of Books, about essential insiderism versus scientism. So I see this kind of discussions very welcome in a way to balance also the dominant discourse on Roma. So one way to address that issue will be that over the next days we will announce the new journal, Critical Romani Studies, and we hope that some of the papers presented here will be published in the journal. We have also, we are in contact with some publishers that are willing to publish the proceedings of this conference, but that will be something we'll discuss later on with each author. However, there is an interest exactly because of the topics we discuss here, and I think we are quite relevant for the larger discussions going on in academia, not only related to Romani studies, but you know, related to other groups. So let's have a coffee now, yeah?
Yeah, and now a well-deserved coffee break. Please go to the second floor, take your badge with you. Yeah. Don't use that door because the security guys already told us that it's only for emergency. So, and we continue sharp at noon with a quite pioneering panel on critical race theory.